What will be our generation's legacy in 50 years' time? What are we leaving behind for those we love? It's a hard thing to hear, but decisions you make today impact on what their lives will look like. Even more important than what you do is what we as a society choose to do. The reality is, today the world is at least 1 degree hotter than it used to be, and we are turning that heater up to 11. Bushfires incinerating our homes, droughts squeezing our farms to death, and never before seen storms sweeping houses out to the ocean. This is not our future, this is our present, and we are accelerating it at a blistering pace. Right now, Australia has no plans for doing anything about it. In fact, we have resolved not to make any plans. In the IPCC report, released last month, we found out that there are a number of scenarios we can expect, and they are progressively bad to catastrophic. People who say, look, the climate has always been changing and it will continue to change, those people are just patently wrong. Scientists understand the physics behind all of this, and it is extremely obvious that we are the ones that are causing this warming. We've just had the hottest 100 and something years in more than 100,000 years. In fact, the kinds of planet-changing warming that we're seeing is impossible from natural causes, like the sun getting brighter and volcanoes erupting more often. The wiliest deniers nowadays talk about the jobs that depend on polluting and how we will plummet headlong into an economic depression if we do the slightest thing about global warming. But the thing is that global warming is destroying our livelihoods and will be plunging us into severe catastrophe. See, the scenarios the IPCC looked at all show 1.5 degrees of warming is unavoidable, and we are probably going to hit at least 2 degrees. But if we do nothing, we could turn this whole planet into a hellscape. See, the IPCC has looked at 5 scenarios, 2 where we increase polluting, and 1 where we keep polluting at roughly the same rate and only start reducing near the end of the century, and 2 where we act to reduce pollution right now. We won't look at the scenarios where we increase polluting, because in those cases, we drive the climate into such crazy places, we have no idea what would happen. We end up triggering so many feedback loops that the problem gets worse exponentially. Instead, we will look at what happens if we continue with a mild, business-as-usual response, doing mostly nothing till the end of the century. Here's what we can expect to happen. 10-year heat waves will happen 5 to 10 times more often than they used to, and 50-year heat waves will happen 14 to 40 times as much. What does that mean? Well, look, the heat waves in 2019 started massive bushfires throughout New South Wales. They resulted in almost 2,500 homes being destroyed, 17 million hectares of land burnt throughout Australia. How many livelihoods were destroyed as a result of those fires? 33 people, including 9 firefighters, died during these blazes. If we continue to not care about this issue, even more people will die. Livelihoods will be ruined, farms will be incinerated, and homes will be burnt. Right now, we are not considering at all the impacts of this sort of bushfire raging through our country almost every fire season. Whenever anyone brings up a conversation about global warming, the topic of conversation becomes about how much is it going to cost? How much is it going to cost to not do anything about it? What happens when we see these sorts of bushfires amplified times 40? We can expect droughts that used to happen once in 10 years to happen 2.5 to 4 times more often. Right now, 2/3 of Queensland are in drought, despite the recent rains. Dams are barely half full, and places like Toowoomba, they need to have 12 truckloads of water driven in daily. The IPCC report shows that most of the Australian east and much of the area around Perth will have much drier soil. Agriculture that grows in these areas will soon become unsustainable. This is going to get much worse, and in our lifetimes, we will see that nothing can grow there, and the communities that once lived there can go on no longer. At the same time as all of this drought, the rains that we do see will be much more heavy in very short bursts. The maximum rainfall amount in one day will go up by 40%. We saw devastating floods this year in New South Wales. We saw houses north of Sydney being swept away by these floods. 18,000 people had to be evacuated in what was called a 1 in 50 year event. These supposedly rare events will happen 3 times as often. The argument that we need to keep polluting to keep people employed seems completely ludicrous in the face of this. We can choose to invest in huge numbers of clean green jobs around Australia and bring forth a massive technological revolution instead of putting money into dead-end fossil fuel projects. For example, the Australian Greens have proposed plans for Australia to generate 700% of our energy needs and become a green energy exporter. We can supply green energy to places like Indonesia and Singapore. The Australian government could create nationalised solar farms that you own, and the dividends from that could go to paying for services that you need, like Medicare, the pension, unemployment benefits, all the other things. Instead, the Australian government is right now helping fund a nearly $1 billion Gemina gas pipeline in the Northern Territories. That's owned partially by the China state grid, the same Chinese government that the Liberal governments continually rail against, saying how terrible they are and what a terrible influence they are on Australia. The thing is, even though we're a small country, we're a major player when it comes to fossil fuels. In fact, today, Australia is the 3rd largest fossil fuel exporter in the world, behind Russia and Saudi Arabia. We're the single largest natural gas exporter in the world. Almost 90% of the coal and 75% of the natural gas that we produce are all exported. And most of the profits from these heavily subsidized industries are privatized. In fact, coal companies pay even lower taxes than your average Australian business. And many major coal companies, like Glencore, don't pay anything in taxes whatsoever. Being one of the largest exporters of fossil fuel in the world, we account for something like 5% of global emissions. If we include these, per person we emit 9 times more than China, and 4 times more than the US, and 37 times more than India. We also happen to be the wealthiest country in the world. We beat out Switzerland. Now, we're the wealthiest country in the world, and we expect every other country to act on this problem before us. We have the money, we have the technology, and we have the most abundant sources of green energy in the whole world. We also have extremely corrupt parties like the Liberals and Nationals in power right now. They're putting coal and gas executives in charge of our energy future. We also have crazy parties funded by mining billionaires fighting to take Australia into an even worse place. In this coming election, you need to get engaged with this issue. You need to support a party which has real policies on dealing with global warming, because if you plan on being alive or still have family that is alive in 50 years, you are voting for them.